All right, so we're diving into Czech public procurement law. We've got excerpts from the 2016 law and a guide to EU funds. Let's untangle these regulations, especially when EU money comes in.
It's fascinating how this law goes beyond big government projects.
Yeah.
It impacts daily life in the Czech Republic. If a company is building a highway with public funding,
Right.
they could be subject to these specific procurement rules. Even a school district buying apples for their cafeteria falls under this law.
So it's about how public money is spent, not just the government buying things.
Exactly. That's where public contractors come in. It's not just ministries. It includes private entities and public projects or receiving public funding.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
We've got public contractors who need things and suppliers wanting to provide them. But with all this money, there must be ground rules for fairness, right?
Absolutely. Transparency, proportionality, and non-discrimination.
Let's break those down. What's transparency in action?
Imagine you're a small business in Brno wanting to supply computers to a government agency. Transparency means all tender information, the requirements, criteria, deadlines are public.
Giving everyone a fair shot.
Exactly.
What about proportionality? Rules shouldn't be overly burdensome for smaller contracts.
Precisely. The law balances accountability and efficiency. Not every purchase is a multi-million-dollar project.
And non-discrimination. Does a German company have the same chance as a Czech company?
That's the goal. Suppliers can't be excluded based on nationality or irrelevant factors.
It's about the best candidate, regardless of origin. Okay, we've got players and principles. But getting a contract isn't that simple, right?
You're right. There's a maze of tendering procedures.
Okay, lead the way. What are the paths?
The most common is the open procedure. Anyone can bid. The contract goes to the most economically advantageous tender that meets the criteria.
Like an open audition. What else is there?
The restricted procedure. Only pre-selected suppliers based on qualifications can bid for complex contracts.
So a casting call where you need a resume and portfolio. Anything else?
The competitive dialogue.
Okay.
Say Prague wants to revamp its public transport system. They invite companies to pitch ideas and collaborate with the chosen one.
A brainstorming session to pick a creative partner.
Exactly. Then there's the innovation partnership for projects where the solution doesn't exist yet.
Wow.
Like saying, we need a flying car and partnering to build it.
Cool. A procedure for everything from basic supplies to groundbreaking tech. But I bet there are still obstacles.
You're catching on. Suppliers must meet strict qualification criteria.
So more than a good idea or a low price?
Right, like a loan application. Prove you're financially stable, have a track record. It's the same principle.
They want to make sure the awardee is up to the task. What if a company doesn't meet the criteria? Out of the running?
Not necessarily. They can team up like with subcontractors.
To cover gaps?
Yes, like I can design websites but need a coder.
So, flexibility for collaboration. We've covered players, principles, and paths to a contract. Does the law address specific scenarios beyond the basics?
It does. It's nuanced. For example, it allows prioritizing local or sustainably produced food in tenders.
So a school could request local apples.
Exactly. They can consider broader societal goals.
Using the law to promote positive change. Any other areas?
There are provisions for defense and security procurement.
Buying military equipment is more complex than office supplies. What are the key differences?
More emphasis on coordinating with other entities, including European ones, for security and strategic interests.
Lots of oversight and collaboration for those contracts. Okay, we've talked about everything, but what if things go wrong? Who ensures honesty?
The Office for the Protection of Competition. They oversee and enforce compliance. They can investigate and penalize rule breakers.
The referees ensuring fair play.
Precisely. And that brings up a good question. What are the consequences of breaking the rules? Is it a slap on the wrist or something more?
A great question. We should explore those repercussions. But first, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back to uncover the potential penalties for violating the Czech public procurement law.
Sounds good. We'll dive into the world of enforcement and sanctions after the break. Stay with us.
Okay, so the Czech Republic takes upholding its public procurement system pretty seriously. What are the consequences for those who break the rules?
The penalties can be quite serious, a strong deterrent for rule breakers. Fines up to 10% of the contract value, depending on the violation. A hefty sum for large projects.
Wow, that's a real financial hit.
Definitely. And there's more. The Office for the Protection of Competition can also issue a prohibition of contract performance. essentially voiding the contract.
So they could lose the contract entirely even if they pay the fine.
Yes, exactly. It emphasizes that this law isn't just paperwork. It has real consequences for the companies involved.
What happens if a supplier feels they've been treated unfairly? Do they have any options?
Absolutely. The law has mechanisms for challenging decisions. Suppliers can file complaints and appeals. It can involve some complex legal proceedings.
So checks and balances, ensuring rights and protections for all parties. It seems like the Czech Republic has a pretty fair and transparent system. Are there any aspects that stand out as particularly unique or innovative?
There are some interesting features. One is the use of supplier lists, specifically the list of qualified suppliers.
What's that all about?
It's a pre-vetted list of suppliers who've met the qualification criteria, like a VIP club for reliable and competent suppliers.
A stamp of approval. I bet that's valuable for those companies.
It is. It helps them in future tenders, gives them an edge.
But I imagine it's not easy to get on that list.
You're right. A stringent vetting process, lots of documentation, then an annual renewal process to ensure they still meet the standards.
So they have to continuously prove themselves. That really emphasizes accountability.
Precisely. That emphasis on efficiency and accountability also shows up in other specialized tools within the law.
Like framework agreements and dynamic purchasing systems.
Yes, those. They're designed to streamline things.
Let's break those down. What exactly is a framework agreement?
Imagine a ministry needs office supplies regularly. Instead of a new tender every time they need paper clips, they can have a framework agreement with pre-qualified suppliers.
So a pre-approved pool of suppliers for recurring needs. Seems efficient.
It is. Saves time and resources for everyone. But there are strict rules to ensure fairness.
What about dynamic purchasing systems?
Think of it like a digital marketplace specifically for public procurement, a platform where pre-qualified suppliers can submit bids on an ongoing basis.
So an always open auction for things like office supplies, construction materials, even maintenance services.
Exactly. Fully electronic, open system. Easier for suppliers to participate and for contractors to find the best deals.
Framework agreements and dynamic purchasing systems are about efficiency.
You got it. The law recognizes that sometimes speed is key, and it provides the tools for that.
You're talking about negotiated procedures without publication, right?
Yes. There are times when a faster process is needed. For example, urgent repairs after a storm. There might not be time for a lengthy process.
Like a pressure valve for urgent situations.
That
But not a way to bypass the rules altogether, I'm sure.
Of course not. Even in expedited cases, justification and documentation are still required.
We've covered a lot. Principles, procedures, specialized tools, enforcement. It's clear the Czech Republic has a well-developed system for managing public spending. How does this all connect with EU funding?
That's a crucial part. Any project receiving EU funding has to comply with both Czech and EU regulations.
So like speaking two languages fluently.
Precisely. And that's where things can get tricky.
Let's dive into that intersection and see how those two worlds interact.
All right, this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay, so Czech public procurement law meets EU funding. This sounds like a recipe for some interesting challenges.
Right, a lot of challenges. Imagine you're building a wind farm in the Czech Republic.
Yeah.
You get EU funding. Sounds great. But now when choosing contractors, you have to follow both Czech and EU rules.
Like playing a game with two rulebooks.
Exactly, and sometimes they don't perfectly align. There can be subtle differences, even contradictions. You need to understand both frameworks.
Sounds confusing. Got any examples of where these two worlds clash?
One is eligible costs.
Okay.
The EU has specific rules about what expenses their funds can cover, and those don't always match Czech law.
So an expense could be okay in Czech law, but not eligible for EU reimbursement.
Exactly. Say you hire a catering company to feed your construction crew. Allowable under Czech procurement, but the EU might have stricter rules about catering services.
Oh, I see. Little details can really impact a project's budget then.
Absolutely. Meticulous record keeping is essential, and understanding both sets of rules.
You mentioned state aid earlier. What's that about?
The EU has rules to prevent governments from giving unfair advantages to companies or industries. They want a level playing field for all member states.
So if you want to hire local Czech companies for your wind farm, you need to be careful about EU state aid rules.
Exactly. Supporting local businesses is great, but it can't violate EU competition rules.
Sounds like a balancing act. You need legal expertise, strategic thinking, and a lot of patience.
You got it. But the guide to EU funds we have can help. It offers strategies for navigating this. It's like a roadmap.
Like a translator for Czech and EU.
A good analogy. Successfully managing EU funds can really boost projects in the Czech Republic. It's about unlocking potential and making a positive impact.
So connecting regulations with real-world results.
Yes, and it brings us back to why public procurement matters. It's not just about the rules, it's about using public spending to build a better future, building infrastructure, supporting local economies, investing in sustainability.
Making sure that everything we buy with public money contributes to something bigger.
Exactly. And hopefully this deep dive into Czech public procurement law has been interesting and encouraged you to learn more.
This is just the start. Public procurement keeps evolving. Staying informed is key to ensuring that public spending is a force for good.
Keep exploring and asking questions.
And that wraps up our deep dive into Czech public procurement law. Thanks for joining us. Stay curious.